Hello, artists. Today we are going to be using the element of art value to create a winter scene. We're going to need these materials. We need some paper, some colored pencils, pencil with an eraser, and a black marker. I'll be using a Sharpie, but any black marker will do. Now for my artwork today, my first step is going to be creating a background, which will be a sky. For that sky, I'm going to be using colored pencils to really create those different shades that will show value in my artwork. So that transition from light to dark. So I want to think about what color I want my sky to be. I'm going to think about what color pencil I'm going to choose. And I want to think about what time of day my artwork will be showcasing. Is it going to be daytime or nighttime? Is it going to be sunrise or sunset? And I'm going to pick one main color for that sky. So I think I might do an evening sky, and for that, I'm going to be working with the color blue. I actually would love to pick a color that has two different shades in my colored pencils, if that's possible. So I can either work with just this blue, or if I've chosen a color that has a darker shade, then I can use both of those. So I might use my light blue, my dark blue, and then also my black to create my nighttime sky. Now, if you are going to create a sunset sky, you might want to pick some different colors. Maybe you want to use red as your main color, and if you also have a pink colored pencil, that's a lighter shade or tint of red. So you could use pink and red and black as your colors instead. That will be up to you. But what you need to remember is you're picking one main color, and then if your colored pencils come in darker shades as well, you can use those, and then you'll also want a black so that we really get that full range of value. Now, before we get to our artwork today, we're gonna do some practice with value. So let's flip to the back of our paper for some practice. I'm gonna start with just my pencil. Now, what I wanna do is practice value by starting doing some shading as lightly as I can. So here's what that might look like. I'm holding onto my pencil so gently, I'm barely touching the paper, and I'm doing that gentle coloring motion back and forth. I'm keeping my coloring or my shading the same direction and just barely touching the paper. So you can see there's just a little bit of light colored pencil right there. That is going to be my lightest value of my pencil. Now I'm going to transition to shading a little bit darker. This next section, I'm not pressing hard, but just the tiniest bit harder than that first area. And that should give me a value that is a little bit darker than how I started. Now I'm going to keep going. This time pressing a little bit harder. And I should really be able to see the difference between the shades that I'm creating on my paper. We've got that change in value going from lighter to darker. So if these look too similar to me, I might go back over and color that in just a little bit darker. I don't want to go as dark as I can yet. This is still kind of an in-between tone. We would call this like a mid-tone, kind of a medium gray. And then I'm going to start to transition to pressing a little bit harder. I can see I started light and I'm slowly getting darker as I go. Now I think I'll do one more, and this time I'm going to press as hard as I can. You might notice you can get darker color by moving your fingers closer to the tip of your pencil and pressing harder against the paper to get the darkest color. So now with my pencil, you can see I have created that range of value. I've got 5 different shades from lightest to darkest. I'm now gonna try this with my colored pencil. I've got those 2 different shades of blue, but I'm gonna start with just the lightest blue. And I'm gonna do the same thing I did with my pencil. Barely touching the paper, as light as I can go. Then pressing a little bit harder. And again, just pressing a little bit harder each time I create a new shade. Now, if you have 2 different shades of the same color, so here I've got my light blue and my darker blue, I'm actually gonna transition from a lighter blue into a darker blue by doing the following. I've got my lightest shade here down to my darkest shade of my light blue. I'm gonna do another section, pressing as hard as I can, getting as dark of a color as I can. But what will be different this time is after I'm done, I'm gonna go layer on top of that with my darker blue. I'm not pressing too hard yet, but I'm adding a little bit of that darker color. I'm gonna do the same thing again, though this time I might press actually a little bit more gently with my blue, because I'm gonna let the darker blue be stronger on top. So I used a little bit less of the light blue. This time I'm gonna use more of that darker blue to see if I can create a darker shade. That looks a little darker to me. And then for this next one, I think I'll use just the dark blue. So you can see how I combined my light blue and dark blue colored pencil to create these different shades going from the lightest blue to the darkest. Now I'm gonna keep that transition going, but this time I'm gonna go from dark blue into black. So I'm gonna use the same process. I'm gonna start by doing another section of just the dark blue, pressing again as hard as I can. But this time I'm gonna go in with the black and color gently on top of it. The trick is that this first time I add the black, I'm going nicely and gently. Now the next section I do, I'm gonna press a little bit gentler with the dark blue because this shade is going to be less blue and more black. So there's my blue. Now I'm gonna come in with my black and layer on top. And then this time, for that last section, I'm gonna do full black. So there is my darkest shade. I've gone all the way from light blue to medium blue to black. Now that I've done some practice with value and my colored pencils, I'm ready to get started on my artwork. So I'm gonna flip over to the front of my paper. Now my paper is a pretty big space. With this value technique, if I filled up my whole paper, it would take a really long time. So I'm gonna give myself a smaller area to work with by drawing a medium-sized rectangle here in the middle of my paper. We're gonna create a little frame for a smaller piece of artwork. I'm gonna sketch really lightly. That way, if I need to erase any lines and fix them as I go, I can do that. You can also use a ruler or the straight edge of a notebook to help you draw straight lines. I'm gonna go ahead and freehand it, and if my lines come out a little bit wobbly, that is okay. I'm just gonna say that makes my artwork more interesting and artistic. So now that I've got my artwork framed out, I can start working on my background. Remember, we're going to be creating a sky for our background. So I'm actually going to have the lightest part of my paper be a circle. And I'm going to imagine that that's the moon or the sun, depending on what time of day my artwork takes place. So I need to make a decision about where my moon or sun is going to be and leave an empty white circle in that area. If you want to, you can really gently use your pencil to sketch out that space. I'm gonna leave a space about this big for that white. So you can see I've sketched that out super, super lightly. Now, my next job is going to be creating my sky by adding that value. Now, what's gonna change this time is that as I start to color in that lightest shade, I'm going to turn my paper as I go, coloring super, super gently a circle around my moon. Then I will be creating the darker shades coming out from there. We call that a radial pattern, where we're coloring in a circle that moves out. So let's look at what that first circle is going to look like. Going in my absolute lightest shade of blue, coloring so gently. Okay, let's take a look at my artwork. I now have that first ring in my lightest shade. I'm gonna now move out to my next ring and add color that's just a little bit darker. So that means pressing a little bit harder, moving away from that inner circle to create another ring. Alrighty, so now I've got that moon in the middle, the lightest shade here, a little bit darker, and I'm gonna keep doing those shades, getting darker and darker as I go. Now, as you can see, as I'm doing my rings, I'm gonna start to run into the edges of my paper. That's okay. I will just continue as far as I can. Imagine where that ring continues around and pick up where I left off. Now right around here where I'm starting to get to my darkest shades of my blue, if you're like me and you have two different shades of the same color, like a light blue and a dark blue, this is where I'm gonna start to transition to that darker shade of blue by layering it on top of my lighter blue. If you only have the one color that you're using, then this is where you'll start adding shades of black. Now remember, as I start to add in those transitional rings, I'm going with the darkest shade of my first color, lighter layered on top of my second. But then when I get to my next ring, I'm gonna go lighter with my first color and darker with my second. Now, after I've done some rings where I've layered my colors on top of each other, I'm gonna transition fully into that darker color. Now, if you're like me and you've been transitioning from a lighter color to a darker color, and then whenever you're ready, you can start transitioning into black. Alrighty, so that is my background all complete. I've got my lovely night sky here with the moon glowing bright in the center as that white color, and then transitioning out, really showing the value in all of these different tints and shades of the color blue. Now remember, what I've created so far is just my background. It's my sky, it's what's going to be at the back of my artwork. So I need to decide what's going to be in the foreground. The foreground is the part of the image that looks closest to me. So given that this is going to be a winter scene, and I've got this bright light back here from the moon or the sun, depending on what you've drawn, I'm going to be doing all of my images on top in silhouette. Silhouette means where we just see the dark shadows and shapes of the images we're looking at instead of seeing the detail inside. The light's coming from behind an object, and so all we can see is the black shape that it creates. Now, what you add is up to you. Maybe you want to add some rolling hills here in the foreground, and then some trees growing out. Maybe there's a little animal you want to draw. I'm gonna leave that up to you. I'm going to be drawing some trees that are growing up in front of my moon and my night sky. You're welcome to use some of those ideas or add your own. Now the first tree I'm gonna draw is going to be what we call a deciduous tree. Deciduous trees lose their leaves in the wintertime. And the main thing I want to keep in mind about when I'm drawing a deciduous tree and I'm really focusing on the branches is that all of my lines will start thicker at the bottom and get skinnier up towards the tip of the tree or out to the edges of the branches. So I'm gonna start with kind of a little wobbly line that maybe zigs and zags a little bit, and then I'm gonna start to trail off, lifting my pen off the paper, and then I'm gonna come down following that same line, but instead of being completely parallel, as I go further and further up my tree, my line is gonna get skinnier and skinnier until it comes together with that first line. And that's gonna be the trunk of my tree. And I'm gonna go ahead and color that in. Now my tree is gonna need some branches. So I'm gonna come up, especially where we've got these bends, that might be a natural place for some branches to grow off. So I'm gonna think of this as kind of a Y, and I'm gonna create a branch that comes off this way, kind of creating a wobbly line just like I did before, deciding where I want it to grow, and then trailing off towards where I want that branch to end. I'm gonna come down to the base, I'm gonna thicken that up a little bit. I don't want it as thick as my trunk, but right now it's all one skinny line, so I do want it to be a little bit thicker. But then it can get skinnier as I get out towards the edge of that branch. Now off of this branch, maybe are growing some smaller branches. So looking for those natural bends in the line, doing a little wiggly line that comes off of that, thickening up the base again, trying to not be as thick as the branch that it's growing off of, but just a little bit thicker at the base, tapering off towards the end. And then maybe off of that branch is growing another little branch. My lines are also getting shorter as I go until I just have these teeny tiny little twigs. And so I might have a branch that looks something like that. I'm gonna keep that process going, adding different branches to this tree. is a deciduous tree that's lost its leaves, but you could also draw a coniferous tree or an evergreen tree, which are trees that have needles and they keep those all year long. Now, whenever you decide you are happy with your design and your artwork looks complete, you can go ahead and sign your work.